This episode of Communism Survivor will document the life of Cuban socialism survivor Junie Lopez. Junie discusses her various experiences living in Cuba and the similarities she sees today in America.
So, you are from Cuba.
Born in Cuba. Mm-hmm.
Wow, what was it like being in Cuba?
So I left when I was young, before I was 10 years old.
Wow.
So my memories, obviously, they're, I have my very ingrained memories, but obviously they do not compare to the experiences my parents had, or the experiences of those that have grown up in there. Like I still have family members that still live there. But I have enough memories to understand how bad life was while living in Cuba.
Have you ever gone back there since?
When about 20 years ago, my grandfather was dying, and we had never gone back. And my mom went back for 3 days just to make her peace. And so we did go back and it was the 3 worst days. One of the 3 worst days I can't remember.
Why were they so bad?
Just because you see you kind of detach yourself maybe a little bit from it when you're not in the day-to-day, but once you see it, when you see what your family is going through and how things are, it's very hard to see the reality of it.
Well, when you were like younger, 9 or 10, did you see things that you thought were okay, and then when you left, it was not so okay?
Well, one of the things I remember the most, even a very young one, even without knowing anything else, I remember very clearly the lack of freedom of speech. I remember that you could not disagree with the government. If you did, you couldn't, and publicly. You could only disagree with the government with very closed doors and with very few people. Because you cannot trust your friends, you cannot trust your neighbors, you cannot trust your own family. So very young, I remember that not having that freedom of speech, not being able to speak against anything. Wow. We have my daughter's godfather, his father, got thrown in jail for many years. He was a political prisoner. He just died recently, about 2 months ago. And when the revolution first came out, obviously he spoke against it, and he got caught, and they threw away the key for many years. Wow. So that's what happens when you speak against the government in Cuba. So I remember that being one of the first things, that lack of freedom of speech, and the lack of not being able to trust anyone. Again, like I said, they've done a great job at. If you disagree against if I could be maybe on the street and I'm with my husband and I say something against the government, or something that is even somewhat similar, close to that, and you hear me, all you have to do is say, hey, that one over there, it's against the revolution. They come pick you up, and that's it. You may or may not be seen off again, depending on the gravity of your record and whatever record you have. So.
When you were younger, do you remember going shopping with your parents or anything like that?
So shopping, it's a very fluid term when it comes to Cuba, I guess. So I remember making very long lines for everything. So the basic needs, for example, so you don't go shopping. So when it comes for the basic needs, such as food, you are given a booklet. And in that booklet, each family in Cuba is given one booklet. And you said, okay, the government is going to give you, for a family of 3, they tell you how much they think you should eat on a given month. So for a family of 3, you get 6 eggs, and if you get lucky, maybe a quarter of a chicken. So the thigh and maybe a piece of it. And then maybe you get a pound of rice. So for a family of 3, that's what the government feels that you should eat. So let's say the stars align and chicken comes in. The government brings chicken into their store. You hope that you make it there, that by the time your turn on the line gets there, they haven't run out of the chicken that they brought. Because then you just have to wait until the stars align again and the next time. And maybe you're given 6 eggs for the family for the month. So, there's no such a thing as shopping. There's, you have to, and I'm not even going to go into the details of like the currency they have. If you go to, yeah, exactly. If you go to Cuba and you have if you are a tourist and you go to like the tourist stores, you can buy things with the dollar. Cubans cannot do that. But the other thing I wanted to mention, or one of the things that I remember leaving Cuba, obviously, it was, once you decide to leave the country,
Right.
you are persona obviously non grata. Your job gets taken away right away, and in the case of my parents, their jobs get taken away right away, and then you just have to kind of survive somehow. You either make your own things to sell, either try to get food somehow through the what's called the black market,
Right.
so you can sell maybe pastries or something to your neighbors. Hopefully you don't get caught by someone.
What happens then?
So there's
Throw away the key?
you throw away the key.
Okay.
But or also you have the scenario when your neighbors or people know that you're leaving the country. In the case of my parents, my father got seriously beat up to cover my mom, because there was a mob that came to tell us how we were against the government and the revolution, and so there's all that
Wow.
kind of stuff. So speaking definitely against the government is not. I think one of the most vivid memories and most impactful in my life was when we had to leave the country. We did tell, my family knew that we were leaving, but what we couldn't tell them was, once my parents went through years of paperwork and I finally being able to leave the country, because we left through Spain. We didn't come directly to the States. We went through Spain. Once my parents did all the years of paperwork and all that, once we were able to have a date that we were leaving, we couldn't tell my grandparents, the ones that were alive, because my dad's parents had just passed away. But we couldn't tell my grandparents, because at that time, when you live in a socialist or communist system like that, your kids don't belong to you. Your kids belong to the government. So in that time, when we had the date and we were ready to leave to the airport, among many other things that we had to do, was we couldn't tell my grandparents. We went to the airport, we got on an airplane and left. Because at that time, what was happening is obviously families are being separated. You never know if you're going to see each other again. So there's a lot of emotions that rise in a situation like that. So what was happening is that parents with their kids were at the airport with their family. Things got emotional, kids started crying, grandparents started crying, so the government will come, the military police will come and tell the parents, obviously your child is distressed, they do not want to leave the revolution, so you're welcome to leave, but your kids stay behind. So as a parent, what do you do in that situation, right?
Wow.
And they have full right of you. That's why I don't want to visit Cuba even today, because even though I have nothing to do with the system, or I had left very young, if I want to go back to Cuba, I cannot go back with neither my American passport, I cannot go back with my European passport. I have to go back with a Cuban passport that is worthless and you cannot use anywhere else in the world. And what that does to them is that the moment I walk into Cuba, I'm a Cuban citizen. I have no rights covered for
wow.
American, or my American passport, or my European. So I am fully to their mercy. So
I guess a lot of people don't realize that.
So that's why a lot of us do not choose to go back,
Right.
because, well, for many reasons, but that's one of them. The moment you walk in, you're fully Cuban citizen, they can throw away the key.
Well, you were 10 years old, right? When
Yeah.
that all happened. When your parents told you that you were leaving, how did you feel about that?
I remember that conversation like if it was today. I can still see it. I can still see my parents sitting us on a kind of a tall kitchen table that we had, and they're telling me, this is what we're doing. I was actually probably 8 or 7 when that happened.
Okay.
So they told me, because it took years, right, before for the paperwork and all that to take place. So I remember very clearly them telling me, this is what's going to happen. This is what we're doing. This is what's going to happen. And this is what this means. You cannot say anything to anyone. These are the people that know, and you just have to continue life as normal. We never know what's going to happen, So I had to, very young, learn how to keep secrets. And just continue living life and understanding a lot of and it was very good that they did bring me to the table on it, because I, very young, without understanding, I did understand somehow a lot of the things that were happening. So I remember when we were leaving, we lived in the same house as my dad's godmother. And she was one of the ones we couldn't tell that we were leaving and when, because of the emotional connection that I explained earlier at the airport. And we had to literally move a house out of her house because we lived like a kind of inefficiency in the back of her house. And we have to move furniture and do all sorts of things without her knowing. Or every street block in Cuba has what's called the Committee for Revolutionary Defense. Every street has that. And what that means is that there is one person in every street that is a government identity. And their sole job is to watch their neighbors and see whether they bring in more food than they should, who they're mingling with, do they move furniture or do they not move furniture? Remember, there's no private property in Cuba. So everything belongs to the government. So anything that is out of the ordinary, these people have to report it. So we had to, I remember my parents moving certain things at all sorts of towns to just kind of get away from these people. So it's a very interesting system to grow under.
And when you stepped off the airplane, I don't know what entry.
Madrid.
When you came into the U.S.
Oh, to the U.S., yeah.
What?
Well, we lived in Spain for 6 years.
Oh,
after,
okay.
So there was an adjustment period. Okay. So yeah, absolutely. But going back to one of the things you said about living in Cuba, I remember one of the things also one of the things being so young, and without knowing, you kind of know that something is not right. I remember going with my mom to vote, and I remember thinking, who are you voting for? And her explaining to me, you only get to vote for one person. There's no more than one person to vote for. So, and I remember thinking, very young again, well, how does that work, right? So that didn't make any sense. So yeah, so the voting for just one system, you can vote within different people of that, and not obviously not Castro at that time or his brother. You don't get to vote for those roles, but within the same party, you get to vote for maybe different elective. Okay. So another thing that I also remember catching my eye, being very young and living in Cuba.
So you get off the plane from Spain into the U.S. What kind of an emotion was that for you then? Because then you're 16 or 17? Well,
no. So when we moved from, I was 10 when we got to Spain, and then I got here, at 16. So.
Yeah, 16.
But my first impression was landing in Spain, right? Which it was back then was still kind of a borderline third world country, Yeah. So, but I remember seeing food so when we left Cuba, speaking of shopping, there's no such a, you cannot go buy shoes because, so my mom, I remember once in Cuba, shoes were available. So you can go buy shoes. So my mom bought me a pair of shoes. So when we would leave the country, I would have a pair of decent shoes to leave the country with. And that was probably 2.5 years before we actually got the date. Guess what happened between
fit?
7 and almost 10? My fit grew. So I remember very clearly walking, putting the shoes on and walking to the plane with my toes very closed into the shoes because those were the best shoes we could get so we could leave the country. We got in the airport. And we got in the airplane, and seeing Coca-Cola for the first time, right? At 10 years old, that doesn't exist in a place like that. I remember very clearly when we got to Spain, my parents had, obviously, the planners, God bless them that they are, they had saved money, and somehow, I don't know the intricacies of it, but they were able to get money out of the country. And so when we got to Spain, we had some sort of, money saved for us. They've never liked to depend on anyone. So that was one of the first things that they had ready for us. So when we got to Spain, I remember very clearly walking into a market. I can still remember the aromas of olives, of seeing strawberry for the first time. Just some of the things that we take for granted, and just those experiences that I close my eyes and I still feel, like I said, the aromas, the feeling, even the wind and things like that. It just put me in a place and a time, and realizing as a very young child what that meant. And obviously, the one that I remember very clearly, walking into a toy store for the first time. Toys, their kids in Cuba don't have toys. It's not like you can go and buy a toy. In Cuba, again, the government tells you what you need. The government rules your life, every sense of it, even what you think, all of it. But for kids, every 2 or 3 years back then, the government said, okay, we're gonna, give toys to kids. So you got into a lottery system where your entire neighborhood, as a parent, you got a lotto system. So they had week 1, and then you get to go to the toy store on week 1 or week 2 or week 3. And guess what happens with the supply as time goes by? I guess it goes down significantly, right? So I remember we never had really week 1 or day 1. We always got somehow the leftovers. So I was telling Ryan that the day that first time I met him, that I remember the year we were leaving. My parents already knew we were leaving. It was shortcoming. I don't recall exactly if they had the date or not, but they knew we were about 3 months of leaving. And we get week 1, day 1, which is like literally winning the lotto. So I remember rushing to the store to see what they had. And obviously they had toys, and you could only get one good toy. They had the names for it. One good toy, one middle toy, and one like low level toy, like dice or something like that. And I always wanted a bike. Never had one. And I remember running to the store and seeing they had like 4 bikes right up on top. And I remember, oh my God, this is my chance. I'm gonna get the bike. And one of the things that happens in that process is obviously parents being parents, wanting to do their best for their children. They save Cuban pesos or whatever it is, or half a pork or whatever it may be, so you can barter with the people that are on the front of the list, right, at the front of the line. Hey, I'll give you this if you give me your number, because my kid really wants that. And so there's a lot of that going on. And I remember I was so excited. I had my eye on the bike, and this gentleman comes up to my father and starts the negotiating. Hey, I'll give you this if my son really wants a bike. I remember it was a boy. He really wants the bike. And I remember standing there listening, very young, listening like, oh, don't do it. And he did it. He's like, and my father, who God bless him, is one of the best human beings I've ever met. He's like, you know what? He told them straight out, we're leaving. Here, you have it. So he gave our place to that gentleman, and they got the bike, and I did not get the bike. And I still remember my father kneeling down and telling me, explaining to me how it's like, listen, you're really not going to be able to use it. We're going to leave. I'm going to be able to get you a new one when we get where we're going and all that. But
did you get your new one?
It was a long time before I got my bike, because again, my parents never got any hand-me-downs, so all they did is work very hard when we got to Spain, and it took a while before we could afford one. So,
well, in today's environment in this country, what would you tell young Americans, or even your daughter, about your past and those experiences?
Well, I'm in marketing, so I think socialism is the marketing department for communism. So it's definitely socialism is communism 101. There's no such a thing. People say, they're very different systems. So the reason why I'm here today is because based on everything that I'm seeing, I can't afford to stay quiet or to just, turn a blind eye to it. There's too much going on to say I can afford not to get involved. We're past that point right now. So I think socialism does a great job. I hear a lot of that, that it's kind of repurposing things, and everyone is going to be good in socialism. But socialism takes from everyone, obviously the middle class, and it tells you that it's going to distribute it equally to everyone. It does not. It just distributes to the top chain of the food chain, to the people that are in charge. but when eventually runs out, what happens once they run out, giving away, everybody's things to
Right.
themselves, actually. What happens is that then it turns into a system where everyone is just equally miserable. And we've seen that happen over and over again. I keep hearing, that would never happen here, which I remember when I lived in Miami with Venezuela. Venezuelans, a decade and a half ago, that would never happen here. And story tells us differently, right? Or, and that's what I'm afraid of with what's going on today, that it's never going to happen here. But the one thing with socialism and communism is that it doesn't work anywhere. It doesn't matter where you try to test it. The other thing is, when it comes to socialism, and I know there's a lot of stories out there, but, redistribution of wealth. Well, my grandparents they lived in Spain. They were all Spaniards. And they left Spain during the 30s, during the Spanish Civil War, and they left to Cuba. And they created their businesses. They had very successful businesses, transportation, restaurants, and all that. And when Castro took over, obviously he removed all the private industry, anything, private property, private commerce, all of it. And my grandparents lost everything. They died, all of them died in Cuba, with all their paperwork, all their ownership papers and everything, hoping that it was, at first hoping that it was temporary, right? It was just a phase. And they all died there dirt poor. They never got their properties back. They never got anything other than just pure misery. So that's definitely one of the things that it's very, very dear I hear about when I hear about socialism and all those things, the ideas of that coming here.
They say one of the better things about socialism is the healthcare.
Definitely. That's what I hear about healthcare. There are two kinds of healthcare in Cuba right now. And probably I would say any socialist or communist country. There is the one that is for the marketing team, I guess, for their military, or for the tourism industry, right? You get sick, you go to an all-inclusive, you're Canadian, and you go to an all-inclusive resort in Varadero in Cuba. You go end up in a hospital, you're going to go to a hospital that is specific for tourism. There's no such a thing as free anything in Cuba. There's no free education, because students starting in middle school, they have to go to working camps to pick up produce. They pick up tomatoes or lettuce or whatever it is that the government is growing. That's what your summer camps. That's what you do as a student. So your education is really not free when you're paying with your own child labor. There's no such a thing as free education, because in Cuba you don't get to choose to be if let's say I want to be an engineer, I don't get to choose that. The government tells me what there's a need for. And if Angola has a need for doctors, I'm going to be a doctor. And when I'm done with my medical education, I don't get to put my skills as a doctor to serve the Cuban people. I get sent to Angola to serve, Angola pays Cuba to have doctors in there. And the doctors don't get paid that salary. Let's say Angola, for just pays the Cuban government $100 for that doctor to be in Angola. The doctor gets $5. The other 95 the Cuban government keeps. So when that doctor is done paying for their doctor's education in a foreign country, it's never usually Paris or or a nice place. It usually tends to be the not so nicer places on the face of the earth. When that doctor ends paying for that after being out of the country for 4 or 5 years, they come back to Cuba and they get rewarded by being able to apply for a lotto for some sort of bad quality car. That's how you get paid for. You get submit your name for a lotto for a car after being away for 4 years. When you go to Cuba as a Cuban citizen, when you go to a hospital, you have to bring your own bed sheets. When you eventually get there, let's say you need surgery. When you eventually get there, you need to bring your own Tylenol. If you can find it, good luck finding it. There's no Clorox materials for the staff to clean the hospital, so the sanitation is beyond horrific. And again, you bring your own towels, you have to bring your own bed sheets if you want to lay down in a bed. So that is the wonderful health system that Cubans get to enjoy, and it's very different from the health system that tourists or military or the military echelon gets to see.
Do you see similarities that are happening right now in this country to what you've experienced?
So the suppression of freedom of speech, to me, it's horrific. I think that what's called the silent majority of this country can no longer afford to remain silent. If we fall asleep at the wheel of freedom of speech, this country will not, the future of it is not good. So we cannot afford that to happen. And like I said before, I don't think we can afford to say that would never happen here, because history has repeated several times itself, and it's proven that it can happen. I think the push of the media against the core values of this country is repugnant. So it's constantly any medium that you are on, the same agenda gets pushed. And for those of us that somewhat know maybe a little bit different, we can read between the lines. But those of us that had never experienced it, it sounds great. It sounds great on paper. Two things. I'm a political science major. So when I was in college, I had two teachers that political science related. One had a huge Karl Marx poster in his room and walked away from his room twice because he was just not willing to have a constructive conversation with me. And even though I was a good student, I walked away with a C from that class because there was an opposition of views, and he did not want to listen to what I had to say. There was another teacher that I went to school with, took several of his classes. He believed in Karl Marx and his philosophies so deeply that in 1979 he packed up his bags and left to Russia. He lived in Russia for 10 years, and by the time I got to him, he would teach the class telling students, I believed in it so much, and I can tell you today that it works. It sounds great on paper, but when you leave socialism or communism on your bones, it doesn't work. And that's very interesting because I know youth that sounds very appealing to, and youth are not so much youth. I have not met anyone that it's inclined with that philosophy and that has lived it. I invite everyone, go to Cuba. Go spend a month, not at the all-inclusive resort. Go spend time with a family where they have to make lines to get toilet paper if they get lucky to that point where they can actually go, because otherwise you have to use, the Cuba's newspapers. So, you have to go through that experience of, if you get caught from your point A to point B with half a pound of a steak, you go to prison. Go to Cuba and live the reality of it. Right. And come back, and then we'll talk. Once we can have an educated conversation of experience. Let's talk about that. I have not found anyone that has taken me in the offer yet. So.
Well, you were, like you were saying, you were 9 or 10 when you left. So I would suspect you didn't have any expectations about where you were going. You right. just, but the expectations your parents had, obviously, they were for you. Correct?
That. Yes, sir.
So how did they explain to you, because still you were young, you knew things weren't quite right, but it's still your home. So
right.
They're asking you to leave something you were familiar with,
right,
to go someplace brand new.
Well, I guess I'm going to put it in terms right now. Let's say if my daughter did not have her iPhone and I said, listen, we're going to go to a place where you can buy as many iPhones as you want. She'll be like, sign me up.
Is that true?
So I was the same thing. They spoke to me of we're going to a place where there's food. There's no shortage of food. where you have toys. But I remember very clearly talking to me about food, because I remember also very clearly before we left, my dad's mother, my grandmother lived with us.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow my parents were able to get a steak somehow, not through the normal channels, through probably the black market they were able to get. And I very clearly remember next to that table that I was telling you where they sat me down, I remember overhearing them, the conversation that there was only one steak, and who did they give it to? Did they give it to my old grandmother or to me? So that to them was not even part of the equation, who they were going to give it to. So obviously they decided to split it up, and my grandmother got a little bit and I got a little bit. But so I remember my parents explaining to me that the place that we were going to, I was going to be able to eat steak. So that's why I'm not a vegetarian, with all due respect. But something like that. Also, one of the things that scares me a lot that I see nowadays is the indoctrination of children. In Cuba, I remember wearing my uniform, my revolutionary uniform, and being indoctrinated in the school that capitalism was bad, and how horrific capitalism was, and how good the revolution was. And I see that now. I see how the universities, like I mentioned, have been doing that for a long time.
Right.
They did it when I was in college. And then, but now they stepped it up and they're indoctrinating. There's a huge push to indoctrinate elementary school kids. And if you follow even the philosophies of Hitler, that's what they did. You get them young. And again, I think parents have naively trusted the system to teach the kids the facts, and for teachers to leave their personal bias, whatever that may be, at home. And we see that that's not happening. So I believe parents cannot longer trust the system of what's being taught to their kids. We have to be more hands-on as to what is in the history books, what kind of books they're giving for summer reading, and what's going on. Because in the indoctrination of children is definitely something that scares me. The movement against family values also scares me a lot. And you see that everywhere. You see that on social media. You see it in the news. The movement against the right to bear arms. In history, the facts are there. Look at history. Every system, the first thing that they do, every socialist or communist system, the first thing they do is disarm their population. So that also scares me a lot. There's a huge pushing against that. The defunding the police is another one, right? So in Cuba, they got rid of the police. They got replaced with the military police, right? So run by the government. So what are all this? There's just a huge push of a lot, and it's all kind of like cohesive, right? You see it coming from every end. And if you don't read between the lines, you just think it's not a big deal. One of the things that caught my eye during COVID was you hear all over the news. If you see more than 10 people gathering, if you see your neighbor across the street with 10 more than people during their family during Thanksgiving, give us a call. And what that does is it starts teaching you little by little, tell on your family, tell on your friends, tell on your neighbors, right? Mm-hmm. And instead of creating that closeness of we're all equal, we're all alike, it starts creating the them against us.
Right.
And that's what happens in Cuba. In Cuba, you cannot trust your family because they will tell on you, and then they'll throw the key out on you. So that's a lot of the things that I've seen, and that's the reason why I'm here. Because it may seem not a big deal. Maybe if you look at each of those things by themselves, when you put them all together, it sounds a lot like where I came from. And that's very scary.
Well, thank you very much.